Good evening. Welcome to the Museum of Science Boston. I'm James Wetzel, the producer of adult programs here at the museum, and I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's very special event, Make, Think, Imagine, Where is Technology Taking Us? We have an incredible trio of individuals and voices and perspectives who have a fascinating conversation in store for all of us. And tonight actually marks our third year collaborating with our friends at the Institute of Cross-Disciplinary Engagement at Dartmouth, and led by the incredible Marcelo Gleiser. And this partnership continues to be such a valuable one for our adult programming here at the museum. Through this partnership, we have been over the past couple of years able to bring in and welcome such diverse voices and leaders across many different industries here to the museum. So I just want to thank Marcelo and Amy Flockton and everyone at the Institute for their continued partnership. And tonight is no different. We have an amazing program in store. But before we get started, I just wanted to point out this slide above me. A little bit later on, you will all have the chance to ask your own questions to our panel of guests. So you can go on your smartphones at any time tonight to slido.com and enter the code IMAGINE and submit as many questions as you'd like. A little bit later on in the evening, Marcelo will try to get through as many of those as possible. So we thank you for being here, but for now, please join me in welcoming to the stage such a dear friend to the museum, Marcelo Gleiser.
Hi, everyone. I cannot see you, but I'm sure you're here because I sense the presence. Welcome to this evening that is really about the future, or what we can make up of the future by knowing what we're doing here in the present, very much centered in how technology and the future of technology will influence who we are and how we communicate and how we actually exist or not in this planet. So there are some very, very big questions for us to contemplate tonight, and I'm very, very happy to host two wonderful thinkers precisely on these issues. I'm going to introduce them to you very soon. But before I do that, and because we are this Institute of Cross-Disciplinary Engagement at Dartmouth, I want to show you a short video. Apologies if you've seen that before. This is our third event here at the museum that basically explains what is our mission. You know, the mission essentially being bringing questions which are related to the sciences and the humanities into what we call a constructive engagement. You know, how can we learn as scientists from the humanists, and how can the humanists learn from us as scientists, so that we can actually all be part of the big questions that we have to face now and definitely in the very, very near future. So if you could please start the video. The world is a complex place, a network of flowing information and changing patterns, where forces known and unknown generate the most sublime beauty and the most terrifying destruction. The world inspires wonder and doubt, and we humans try to make sense of it all, creating stories, theories, symphonies, and poems. I am Marcelo Gleiser, Director of the Institute for Cross-Disciplinary Engagement at Dartmouth, or ICE. On behalf of all of us at ICE and our partners, I invite you to be a part of our institute, to be a part of this very essential conversation. What is the nature of reality? What is the future of humanity? Will machines think? Will and should we become immortal? Is there free will? Are we alone in the universe? Can science be a path towards spirituality? ICE was created to address these issues and establish new bridges between different ways of knowing. Our mission is to overcome old bigotries and facilitate a constructive dialogue between intellectuals and the general public, creating a community of citizens concerned with the common good, engaging experts, promoting public dialogue, and offering open access courses. One thing is certain: the hardest questions ask for different viewpoints, for a cross-disciplinary approach, for intellectual openness. The sciences and the humanities need one another now more than ever, and we need them both. And in the spirit of the Institute, I will have tonight, we have a humanist, Ted Friend, who is a New Yorker writer, wonderful thinker about questions of technology and their impact on our humanity. And of course, Lord Browne, who just published the book, Make, Think, Imagine. And it is a very big thinker also on the impact of engineering and technology on our lives and certainly on our future. So let me introduce them to you, and then I'm going to invite them both to the stage. So Lord Browne, trained as a professional engineer, was Group Chief Executive of British Petroleum from 1995 to 2007, where he built a reputation as a visionary leader, transforming BP into one of the world's most successful companies. He is now the executive chairman of L1 Energy, overseeing the creation of the largest independent European exploration and production company, Wintershall Dea. He is a member or chairman of the boards of a number of organizations, including the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering, the Francis Crick Institute, and the Courtauld Institute of Art. He holds degrees from Cambridge and Stanford Universities, was knighted in 1998, and made a life peer in 2001. He is a collector of antique books and art, and the author of 4 previous titles, including The Glass Closet, which was called Essential Reading by the Times, and Brave and Fascinating by Sir Richard Branson. Ted Friend, a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1998, a lot of things happened in 1998 apparently here, writes the magazine's Letter from California, even though he lives in Brooklyn. We have to ask him about that. His coverage of Silicon Valley includes portraits of Elon Musk, Mark Andreessen, and Sam Altman, as well as pieces about artificial intelligence, the rise of plant-based meats, and the scientific quest for immortality. He's had his work republished in the Best Technology Writing, the Best American Travel Writing, the Best American Sports Writing, and the Best American Crime Reporting, quite a range. His story, Jumpers, on the people who commit suicide at the Golden Gate Bridge, was turned into the documentary film The Bridge and inspired the Sleater Kinney song Jumpers. His memoir, Cheerful Money, Me, My Family, and the Last Days of Wasp Splendor, was chosen as one of the year's best books by the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, the San Francisco Chronicle, and NPR. As I said, he lives in Brooklyn with his wife, Amanda, and their 13-year-old twins. So please help me welcome Lord Browne and Ted Friend. Now, just that we, as they get seated, so the way this is going to go is we're going to have a conversation which hopefully will go very fluidly for about 50 minutes or so, depending. And then you already know how to ask questions, and I'm going to read the questions from this iPad when the time comes, okay? So, so I invite Lord John, would you like to start perhaps telling us a little bit about your thoughts on technology and the book?
So, good evening. It's very, very good to be in Boston and in this extraordinary institution, which dates back, I had no idea, to 1830. It has to be surely one of the oldest, if not the oldest, museum of science in the world. I thought I'd make 4 very simple points, because I'm sure we can talk about other things later. The first is, why did I write this book? And in particular, why did I call it Engineering the Future of Civilization? The answer lies in so many things. I think Max Perutz, a great biochemist, wrote a book. He wrote his autobiography, which had said, "Why didn't you make me angry earlier?" And actually, that's very often the way things start. I spend a lot of time in arts and humanities. It's my night job. And I realized very quickly people talked about civilization as if it were equivalent to the arts and humanities. And actually, I decided to be rather perverse and say that the thing that really creates civilization is engineering. It creates the platform upon which everything else happens. And it enables absolutely everything. So I argued very strongly that that was what I was going to do, write a book about that and talk about engineering as something that is like Janus, a god that looks to the past and to the future, has two faces. And engineering does just that. It looks to the fruits of discovery from the laboratory, which is the past. They've been discovered. And it looks to the future, to humanity, the market, and other things, to create objects and things which are great for humanity, and that's the future. And in the middle, there's this extraordinary thing that does this big transformation from one thing to another. So that was one of the reasons. The second reason was I realized that people were very nervous about engineering today and science. Maybe not in Boston, but certainly in lots of places I've been. And they fear terribly the speed of change, unknown and uncertain things. So I tried to help explain some of those. But the most important thing is, in my book, to remember that anything that goes wrong can be fixed. Anything that goes wrong can be fixed. Sometimes not perfectly if you leave too much time, but when you engineer something, it has bad consequences. Very often they're unintended, unexpected consequences. The solution is not to stop, but to fix the consequences with more engineering. Third point is, I called the book Make, Think, Imagine. And absolutely everybody has come to me and said, it's clearly a mistake. I know you're going to correct it next time you publish the book. It really should read Imagine, Think, Make, because that's the way things work. So I said, well, not entirely. So the example I thought I'd use tonight was something which is called the second law of thermodynamics. The thing about the second law of thermodynamics is it defines absolutely everything because it tells you the direction of travel of time. And Monsieur Carnot, who invented this, could not have done that unless someone has actually made a steam engine. He observed steam engines, so something was made in order to make him think, and it allows us to imagine. And there are plenty of examples, so I thought I'd do that. Final point I'd like just to make is I have to refer to a quote. Someone I interviewed in this book, a great thinker, turns out to live in Oxford, Anders Sandberg, he features in my book, and he recently pointed out the following, that an easy way to show individualistic rebellion today was to proclaim a dark future. And that's the individualistic rebellion. And if you look around, I think that might be broadly true. So that was an easy way to show individualistic rebellion in the past, actually. Today, actually, the rebellion may just be the opposite. So optimism may be actually what we might now determine and call the new punk. So let's see what we do with that tonight.
That's wonderful. I love it. So Ted, do you want to say a few words too?
Well, John just basically took the wind out of my sails because I'm going to argue the exact opposite, I think. But only to a degree. I think we saw a quote up there from C.P. Snow, which was also, you mentioned in your book, who was a English novelist and chemist who tried to bring together the two cultures, the humanities and sciences, and argued that they were heading apart. And I think there are a number of, certainly John's book is full of sort of examples of that in a way of saying that engineering man, homo engineeri, can be sort of a perfect meld of those two worlds at his best, or her best. Just down the road at Harvard, João Alves, an astrophysicist, was consulting with an artist named Anna von Mertens, who had made a quilt with a long trail of stars. And he had her look at him with some of the images that he was looking at from the Gaia telescope out in space. And I'm going to refer to what he said. He said afterwards, "What blew my mind was how differently she looked at the image. I realized that if I started thinking like a visual artist, I could see much more in my own work. And using, in effect, her eyes, he and his colleagues were able to look at something that had been out there for a while, which was this, it's been out there for a very long time. People have been seeing it for a while, this sort of weird ramp-like cloud between Orion and the plane of the Milky Way. And they suddenly, by looking at it through an artist's eyes, they realized it was the largest object in the galaxy, which is a 9,000 light-year long thing, sort of a stellar nursery that they ended up calling the Radcliffe Wave. That's the optimistic part of it. I think the more pessimistic part of it is when someone from the humanities, Charlie Brooker, the creator of Black Mirror, looked at the Boston Dynamics robot dog videos, which we also saw, I think, briefly there. Mm-hmm. And he looked at that, and he came up with an episode of Black Mirror, which perhaps some of you have seen, called Metalhead, in which these robot dogs who've been programmed to just tenaciously and ruthlessly keep guarding stuff in a post-apocalyptic world end up basically killing off the last human scavengers. It's pretty hard now for me to look at those Boston Dynamics robot dogs videos and not see it through those eyes. And I'm sure if there are any Boston Dynamics people here tonight, they would say, you're totally wrong about that, you don't understand it at all, and they would probably be right, because I don't. I don't know how they make a robot dog. But I think one point that people in the humanities like me, I guess, as you heard, I don't have any real scientific credentials at all, would point out is that, with all due respect to what you were saying, John, I think that the scientists and engineers often underestimate the law of unintended consequences in what they've done. If you look at something like email, which seemed like the most amazing thing, and it's now 73% spam, according to one study. If you look at the internet, which seemed, again, like the most amazing thing, it's 73% Facebook. And Facebook is 73% responsible for Donald Trump. These are sort of back-of-the-envelope figurings. But if you look at antibiotics, which have saved, by some estimates, 200 million lives just with penicillin alone, which is extraordinary, that is an amazing thing we did. On the other hand, the UN has estimated that by 2050, 10 million people a year will die because of antimicrobial resistance. And maybe, as John said, we have to keep engineering to attack that. There is also the largest question of all, which is climate change. Many of the things that the brilliant discoveries that have created the way of life that we made have come at the expense of the Earth itself. And that's not even getting into the question. These are all things that we created, sort of with a basic sense that we're human beings and we expect human beings to use these things, and then they often use them in ways that we don't expect. That's even just leaving aside the issue of an artificial general intelligence, which would think in a way we totally would not understand. And I think that's a worrisome thing that we can talk about.
Wow. Okay. So pretty high stakes tonight, folks. And I think that's exactly the kind of conversation that we need to be having right now. This is very important because one of the tendencies of technology, and I speak as a scientist myself, is to just go. You just go. You have a goal, and you want to build that thing, and you just do it. And while you're in the process of doing that, you're not really thinking so much about, but wait a second, what if I actually reach that goal and I can build that machine, and what is it going to do to people around us? So I think, as the Buddha used to say, wherever there is light, there is shadow, and maybe that is something that I would like John to comment on a little bit. Your book is this beautiful, very comprehensive, almost like a history of our tremendous love affair with engineering and how well we do. And clearly, there's no question about that. We need to have energy, so we started with fire, and look at us now. We need to move, so we started with the wheel, and look at us now. And we need to talk and communicate, so we started with little languages, and now we have this huge network around the world. So I know this is a hard question because it's so much information, but if you could just contextualize a little bit the last 200 years of where do you see engineering changing completely the way we behave as humans, because that definitely has happened, just quickly.
So the single most important thing engineering has done is improve the human condition. So it's increased longevity, it's reduced disease, it's improved health, it's improved education, communication, it's improved and it's reduced the number of people in subsistence living to a very small number in the world. A huge poverty alleviation program. So all of these things are brought to the world through engineering. I always get into a big debate with physicians. I chair, after all, a place which has 4 Nobel laureates on staff who've won Nobel Prizes in medicine. And I say to all of them, but actually the people who've saved more lives are engineers. And they say, that's not true. You look at all the surgery and things like that. And I say, yes, but look at the sewers. Look at the sewers. Look at clean water. That's what saved lives, and that's what will save even more lives if we get that right around the world. Of course, it's important to have everything else, but you start with the basics and go to something more complicated. So I pick that, in answer to a broad question, a broad subject, which is the human condition and improving it, which I think has really happened in the last couple of 100 years, I think. Victorian sewers probably started it all off.
Okay. So what do you think, Ted? I mean, what's the dark side of all this?
Yeah, I'm being cast as the dystopic member of the panel.
I like that.
Yeah.
That's good. No, we need that balance.
We're all doomed because, well, I think in what you were saying earlier, Marcelo, at the beginning of your original question, you were seeming to suggest that, there was a quote that I pulled up, which is a scientist who said, when you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you have your technological success. He went on to say that is the way it was with the atomic bomb, and that person was Robert Oppenheimer. And on a much lower level of eloquence, there's been a lot in the papers recently about facial recognition and people scraping the internet for billions of images and the ways in which it's being used. Right now, half of us in the audience here are in a law enforcement database. Half of us. Just our pictures are up there. The ACLU did a study a couple of years ago, and they, to try to make the point about how privacy invading this is, they ran all the members of the House and the Senate through Amazon's facial recognition software. And they came up with 28 positives for criminals, which were not obviously false positives. They hoped this would have some effect. It hasn't so much. In an article about Clearview facial recognition technology, which is the 3 billion photos off the internet scraper that came out last week, the leading investor said, you can't ban technology. Sure, that might lead to a dystopian future or something, but you can't ban it. And I wondered what you thought about that. I mean, you said earlier, like the answer is to engineer and keep engineering, but are there areas in which technology's consequences are so troubling that we ought to at least think about, if not banning, forfending?
Oh, yeah. So, for example, I think after the Second World War, the world generally looked at the Nazi regime and said, we are not going to indulge in eugenics. That is going to be forbidden. And it's very pleasing to see that the one public demonstration of that, using CRISPR-Cas on 2 girls in China, was condemned globally. So just to, I think we should start there. I think there are several different strands to this argument. Yes, indeed, all engineered products will have unintended consequences, and they will be bad. Some of them will actually be used in the hands of bad people. Bad things happen. Well, I mean, it's just by definition. And the first person who really, in sort of semi-modern times, who said that was the first person who wrote a book about engineering called Real Modern Engineering, Agricola, 1500 or so, 1450. But I think that, so we have to do 2 things. One is we have to engineer out the bad consequences and highlight the things which are really important, come back to that. But secondly, we have to regulate out the bad consequences, commonly called the use of public policy. So I think there are several levels. First is we really do need to remind people as they get educated, as an engineer and others, that there is a personal accountability to examine what they're doing and do it in a way which makes sense for humanity. That's true at the individual level, it's true at the group level, it's true at a corporate level. After all, this is what boards of directors are meant to be doing. They are meant to be representing society at large and seeing that things which are not appropriate for society are not done. So you don't, for example, fix the testing equipment to make all your cars pass under certain conditions if you're Volkswagen. That is the wrong use of technology, for example. And then above that, there's regulation and the law. Problem with regulation is it always lags the consequence. So you need a combination of all these things to happen. But I always think that when people list the things that don't work, you have to imagine, you have to think to yourself of a world where you eliminate all of them. So let's start eliminating the things that we can easily discuss in a room like this, which are bad, and see what the consequences are for us, but also other people. Now, facial recognition has actually been a very important thing to make life better for rich people. So we can open our phone, we can get into a country without having to produce lots of paperwork, we can stand in front of a camera and things like that. We can also, in some cases, feel safer if we really do believe it's being used for the right purpose. We can also feel that if we don't trust the government, and many people don't trust governments around the world, that they're tracking us and that there is someone, as they said in the olden days, every wall has an ear. And we can believe it. Every wall may have an eye. But that's where we need regulation and law to look at the proper use of this activity. So I think everything has an upside and downside, but you have to blend the engineering, the science, the behavior, and the public policy.
Yeah, that's definitely, and I think there is no going back. I mean, technology cannot be put back into the box, and you can't push the delete button anymore.
Right? Well, I think in one or two countries in the world you could probably do it. North Korea, for example, could definitely go backwards and say we're not going to use these technologies.
Who will tell them to do that?
Well, the great leader in North Korea.
Yeah.
So there are some places you could do this.
Yeah, I think so. It's so. Just to put more wood in the fire, because this is a very important conversation, is we talk about laws and trying to implement safeguards, right, in order to avoid the bad use of technology. And the question is, who are the decision makers? You know, who is going to decide what should and shouldn't be doing, for example, with CRISPR technology? Just as a broad example, it certainly should not be the board of directors of the CRISPR technology developing companies, because they have to respond to the stockholders to a certain extent. So just in the decision process, which is something, that technology that will affect all of us, big time, very soon, and is where do we put limits? Who decides what these limits are? This is just a general question for us to think about. And the point is, with certain types of technologies, for example, bioengineering, you could think about biohacking, meaning not an evil superpower, but a guy in a garage in Louisiana, trying to make his dog glow in the dark, which is possible. And you do not need a big lab to do that. And as a demonstration that, look, I can do this with genetics, but I can do many, many other things. And how hard is it going to be for us to regulate that kind of small-scale activity as opposed to big industrial-level activity, which clearly is much easier to regulate. So these are one of the things that keep me up at night. You know.
I don't have an answer, but I think I have another question also, which is something I was thinking about is I wrote a piece, as Marcelo mentioned, about people in Silicon Valley, scientists and venture capitalists who are trying to push the boundaries of human life to make us live longer, in some cases to be immortal, basically, 1,000 years and more. What seems to me a big mistake that they're making is thinking by analogy. They think there is a code of life, DNA, that makes us. There is also a code that makes computers. If you don't like the code in a computer, you can fix it. You reboot it, you patch it, you write a new code, and the same could be done with the DNA. A guy named Aubrey de Grey if we fix these 7 things in the body, he likens us to cars. You know, it's like the muffler's a little wonky, the transmission, the tires, the brakes, and the power steering, and if we fix those things, then we can live forever. But the body is not like a car, unfortunately. But it was hard for me as a non-scientist to figure out exactly what the body is like. I think I was proceeding, there's one part of the thing where I was writing about the epigenome and the genome. And I realized the epigenome I understood in a very loose way as something that tells cells in the body, okay, you're going to be a macrophage, you're going to be a neuron, you should stay that way for your life and not turn into something else. And it was explained to me the epigenome is to the genome as software is to hardware. And that made sense, and I thought that's what I wrote to explain it to readers. But then I was realizing like there's a sort of factitiousness to that where I'm like, if you told me at the point of a gun to write software or to create hardware, I couldn't do it. I don't really know what that means, even in the analogy I'm making, but I think human beings think by analogy. When we are facing a new technology, we think, it's X, the only way I can apprehend X is it's sort of like this other thing, Y, which I may or may not understand, which I think just makes your question harder about who will guard the guardians, because we don't really know, and even the people who think they know, like when you're writing your book, you have wide expertise, but in the book you seem to have, omniscient expertise into everything, and surely you don't. So how do you
because I went to interview 150 people.
Yeah, but how do you know what they're telling you is right? I mean, I'm asking like that question about how do you know I can trust this person? Sure. That seems like the best use of this. How do you?
I think that's called the basics of research, isn't it? So you have to validate and fact check. So that's what you do. You never trust once. I think it's the case you never trust a single source. You never trust a single source. And I've never do. I mean, in business or in writing or in science or engineering, I never trust a single source. Always validate and always measure and remeasure.
Were there any there was an interesting point in your book. I was thinking about it when I was reading recently about DARPA, the defense agency here, had sponsored some research into taking cyanobacteria and using them to make concrete, like biomorphic concrete that can essentially, if you can keep making concrete, it's almost like living concrete. They kind of produce this sludgy concrete. And there's this DARPA project that doesn't seem to have an immediate military application, but there's a part in your book where you talk about all the many things that have come, including antibiotics, from military research. And in a way, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but there's a passage in your book which basically says warfare is the thing that's keeping us at peace.
Not quite.
To some extent.
No, because not everything quite happens that way. I mean, penicillin was not created purely as a result of war. Its manufacturing, which incidentally was nothing to do with Alexander Fleming, who won the Nobel Prize with a couple of other people, 3 men, but it was a woman chemical engineer who is unsung hero in the middle of the United States, who figured out how to make billions of doses of penicillin, which is very unstable, and she cracked it. So she was at home looking after the kids while these 3 men were getting their Nobel Prize in Stockholm. So, it was useful during war. So not everything comes from war, but a lot of things do start in the hands of governments. And it's because governments have much higher, or should have, and very often do have much higher risk tolerance than other parts of society. So they can take the first leap, the first invention. So whether that's semiconductors, which was very much a considered movement by the United States government in funding that, whether it was some of the things that came out of Bell Laboratories that were almost secondarily funded by government, or whether it was the space program, there were a variety of things like that. The biobank in the UK, to name but a few. So that I think you have to be careful which ones came out because government takes the first risk, and which ones come out simply in support of war. War and defense have spawned some extraordinary things. I think it was the use of ships in the Venetian Republic, which was spawned by war and also by trade. So the Venetians came up with a very clever idea about 800 years ago that ships shouldn't get bigger, they should get smaller. Because if you carved up a cargo in not so small ships, chances are you wouldn't lose it all in one go. It's called diversification. And secondly, smaller ships could be kitted out to both be fighting ships and trade ships. And that was convenient because you could decide what you wanted to do next, trade or go to war, and sometimes you had to protect the trade from pirates, so it was convenient to have dual-use activity, dual-use equipment, and the ships were dual-use as a result of that.
Okay, I wanted to turn everything around for a little bit and talk about other issues. So in your book, you mentioned something really cute, and you're ophthalmologist, whom I clearly you have some fondness. And you mentioned that nowadays, because you suffer from glaucoma, there are much more efficient ways of dealing with that problem because of huge databases and artificial narrow intelligence that can actually scan all of that. And my father actually had glaucoma too, so it's something that I don't have, but I keep an eye on. But the question is, you make a statement that even though my ophthalmologist is going to use all this great artificial intelligence and machine learning, he's not going to be out of a job. So I wanted to shift the conversation a little bit to that sort of impact of technology and automation, which is job displacement, and I'm not so sure. I mean, I wanted you to explain to us a little bit why you think that, and because I have a much more pessimistic way of thinking about certain jobs. It's clearly new technologies create new jobs, no question about that. I mean, in fact, I would say that there is a very large fraction, you probably even know the number of jobs that exist nowadays that occupy people that didn't exist 30, 40 years ago. The problem I have is timing, is how long does it take for you to retrain someone who is 40 or 50 years old in a new technology that he or she has no idea about, and how we're going to deal with that. So it's just an interesting conversation to have.
Can I just talk about two things?
Absolutely.
My ophthalmologist. So it's really quite interesting. He used to, when I started being treated, make lots of measurements himself and talk to me and examine the results. Now it's all done pretty automatically, and I see him for about 3 minutes at the end of the process. I keep asking him why his consulting fee is the same, but I see the expert right at the end of the process, not in the middle of the process. And his very good point is this, and I think it's very important to remember that this thing could happen without him being there, to, let's say, a 98% certainty, so pretty high. And so he said, if you had a choice of not having this done or having something done at 98% certainty, what would you do? So the answer is you'd obviously do, if you were about to, if you could avoid blindness, you would clearly do 98%. And so this can be done, this democratizes the process hugely. It means that you don't have to have all these people. And I think one of the things we have to think about is the burden certainly on healthcare systems are such that some of the first line physicians and so forth do need to be pushed to a further point in the chain than they presently work in, because we just are overburdening the system. If we could use the data that we've collected on everybody in a way which makes it be gigantic data to get sensible diagnoses, then we could do something enormous. We would open up again, we would further democratize healthcare without any change, without any inconvenience to the public. So I think these are important changes. Interestingly, you're right, no jobs, jobs disappear and they're remade. The issue is the transition. But here's the thing. When I was at Cambridge, I went in the mid-60s to a meeting which was a very important, high-powered meeting to discuss the impact of automation on work. And the conclusion of this really important set of people was that we had to figure out how to use leisure time. That was the conclusion of this meeting. And of course, that's utter nonsense. So all these distinguished people came up with the wrong answer. So somehow, actually, people have retrained themselves in lots of activities. We found different things to do. We have, in many sectors of society, merged work and leisure. I mean, there used to be, a work-leisure divide. You should keep them separate. Now somehow we have an integration of the two, and people feel comfortable about it. So I think a lot of things keep changing. Quite how long the transition is, I don't know. High-profile transitions, yes, obviously. We have, I think when you look at all the job classifications over the last period since the 30s, 20s, while the Bureau of Labour has kept job classifications, there is only one classification which has disappeared, which is elevator operator.
What do you think the effect of these changes, particularly with artificial intelligence, will be on how we think of ourselves as human beings? Like Larry Tesler, who's the computer scientist who invented cut and paste, the technology we've all probably used, said that human intelligence is whatever machines haven't done yet. And I think there's a way in which how we think of ourselves has obviously shifted from what Copernicus said about where we were to what Darwin told us to what Freud and so forth. And my sense is that as more and more of the things that we pride ourselves on are exceeded by computers, they can read, radiology better than we can. They can pick stocks better than we can. They can play poker better than we can. They can obviously play Go and chess better than we can. As all these things become ceded to them in terms of expertise, how do you see that affecting how we think of ourselves and our place within sort of the system that we ourselves are creating? Are we going to be proud that our child, in a sense, has exceeded us, or are we going to feel thwarted and small?
So the question is, does it actually exceed us? I must say I've been trying to search for the moment of the singularity for a long time. And so far I would say the forecasts have been nonsense, absolute nonsense. So interesting, exciting copy, but not substantive, I think. So the question is, what is this thing, artificial intelligence? It is, of course, based on tools and techniques we've known since, certainly we've applied since the Second World War, and even during the Second World War in a very primitive way to get materiel and fuel and planes and targets all sort of sorted out, optimization processes. So this is not new. What is new is the zero-cost storage and the massive, massive changes in computing equipment. That's something no one really notices, but that's where it's all happening. It's the gigantic hardware that we can get access to that makes so many things more possible. So what are we seeing at the moment? I think we're seeing artificial intelligence being applied to specific tasks and activities, specific sets of data. What we have not seen yet is any movement in trying to recreate a brain, artificial general intelligence. And I think there seems to be two things that mark the human, the exceptional nature of human beings, and I want to hold on to this. First is the ability to imagine. I mean, we really can project ourselves into places we've never been, times that we've never seen, people we've never met, and we can do it, and we can use it for both our entertainment and our enlightenment. So I think that's one thing. And the second thing is, I believe firmly what Bill Gates has made the point, that we lack, we need more people, and we lack them, who can have a role which is empathetic with other people. Empathy is something that as a population, the demographics change, we need more people in roles that require empathy, deep understanding of people, and that is, we have yet to see any idea of how to replace a human. Indeed, should we replace a human with a machine that can do that? So I think we have lots of, I have no idea what the changes will be, but you can see bits and pieces here where it's not all linear. It doesn't mean to say that because we've got a big machine, we can do something, and it means, therefore, that nothing else changes, and therefore we're all out of jobs. That's just not true. I think it all changes quite dynamically.
So basically, we'll do away with doctors, but not with nurses.
Well, we won't. I still think we won't do away with doctors, because they'll be doing things that we have no idea what they're doing. We don't understand today.
That's true.
Including, perhaps even, I think Paul Nurse, who's the director of the CRIC, might stand me in the corner for saying this. We may actually understand, for the very first time, why cancers happen. We're nowhere close to that yet, which means that we understand how to repair DNA, and that would be remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Well, I admire and respect your optimism, and I think it's encouraging. I'm wondering why, it seems to me that one of the things you mentioned in your book is when Samuel Morse sent the first long-distance telegraph message in 1844, it was, "What hath God wrought?" And he meant it in an optimistic sense, meaning this is a benevolent change brought to us by a deity who wants us to succeed and prosper. I think William Gibson famously said in the 80s, the future is already here, it's just not very widely distributed, meaning that a few people have access to it. The jetpacks were invented in 1960, but probably no one came here on one tonight. But Gibson last week said that sense of futurism that we have has evaporated, that it seems that no one's looking forward to the future anymore. And I'm wondering if you have a thought about why that is, if everything is as rosy as you're suggesting.
Well, I hope I'm not suggesting everything is rosy. I believe I'm optimistic, but I believe I'm also clear-eyed. And I'd much prefer to be optimistic and therefore be classified by Anders Sandberg as in the punk category, rather than being pessimistic. It's too easy to be pessimistic. And I do believe that, it's one thing being pessimistic in a rich nation like Europe or UK or the US. It's quite different being pessimistic in a poor nation, which has plenty to strive for. So I think I would like to see more balance here. And I do think that, human beings, I was giving this, talking about the book at the Crick Institute, I obviously had a duty to do. A very intelligent audience, you know, all the Nobel Prize winners and 25 Fellows of the Royal Society, lots of questions. And indeed, one postdoc got up and said, I don't believe a word of it. This is all like E. coli. You know, you put E. coli in a flask, you give it nutrient, things go swimmingly well, they all grow, and they reach a peak, and then things start going downhill. As the nutrients run out, so they die. And he said, that's what a life is like. It's E. coli in a flask. And I said, no, it can't be. I mean, human beings are not E. coli. We are just not. And I think it makes an important point. We actually are highly adaptive entities, highly adaptive. And we observe, and we learn, and we change, and it means that not everything is the same. This is a very complex system of many, many moving parts, each individual, and as a result, we probably almost always save ourselves from the worst side of things, and we actually often create great things for the future. We come back to, you know, what have we created? We have created the means whereby to increase to improve the human lot on average enormously. And that, I think, is important. Give people a quality of life, an education, an enlightenment, and all of that we shouldn't forget.
Good, good. Well, on that note, and because there are an explosion of questions here, and I'm going to do my best to kind of cover as many of them as possible. Quite a few of them, actually, talking about doing good for humankind, kind of go around the fact that, of course, you work in the oil industry for a very, very long time, and it's really about, is it possible? In fact, that was one of my questions too. Shouldn't the oil companies be at the forefront of finding different renewable energy sources? I mean, so they want to stay in power, right?
So in 1997, I'd been 2 years as the CEO of BP, and I stood up at Stanford University and gave a speech which basically said the following. Climate change is real. This is 1997. And the oil and gas companies are accountable for it. They're responsible for it. And I laid out a program and plan for BP to begin to change its operations and change its products, which was very visible and actually worked very well while I was CEO. It didn't go down well with the rest of the oil industry, I have to say. Actually, that's an understatement. I think when I made the speech, the American Petroleum Institute, I've always had a tough relationship with them, said that I had left the church. I didn't understand which church I'd left, but that was the statement. So I believe that, first of all, the people who make a mess need to clean it up. It's a fact of life. And I don't care which mess it is, but you've got to clean it up. So the oil and gas industry is accountable for doing that. Now, where does their accountability start and where does it stop is going to be a huge debate. But nonetheless, they have to do this. So the first thing they've got to do is figure out what to do with carbon dioxide. What to do with carbon dioxide. And there are plenty of things that we can do today, because we will continue to use hydrocarbons for a period of time. I hope we don't use coal. It's a very tough substance, lots of CO2. I hope we'll use oil, it will go out of the system. We'll use gas, it will eventually go out of the system. But the amount of energy involved, when I remind you that 86% of all energy in the world is derived from oil, gas, and coal today, it's a tough shift. So it takes time. And we don't have time, so the shift has to involve getting the carbon out of hydrocarbons. That can be done. It's called carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and use. The tools and techniques exist. And if you set about today and said, I'm going to change the law, that's going to happen, we could dramatically reduce the amount of CO2 quite quickly. It would be very, very costly. So that's point one. Point two, there's a lot of people in the world working on other energy sources. Some are renewable. We think of energy the whole time as supply, so renewable energy is important. That is not energy, it's renewable electricity. It's a very specific thing. It accounts for about 4 to 5% of energy in the world today, and will grow over time, but it takes a lot of time to grow. There are plenty of other sources, nuclear, hydro, bioenergy, which I think remains an area for further development. But on top of all that, there is another side to it, which is demand. So how can you change people's needs for energy? Can you make it more efficient for them to use it? Can you make sure that the energy they save is not actually reused just because it's there? It's like the old story of the refrigerator, right? So people go and buy a fridge that is very efficient. They replace the old one with a new fridge. And then they take the old fridge, put it in the garage, and use it to store beer. So what have they achieved? Not a lot. So that is an example of not using conservation as well as efficiency. So there are plenty of things to do. We've been talking about AI systems, control systems. We could cut a lot of energy out that way. There are plenty of things to do with waste. They need further development. Everyone is talking about plastic waste. How do we get rid of plastics? Can we reuse them? The carbon's already there, being used. Can it be used again? So there are a lot of things to do. I think I summarize it by saying today, actually, if we set our minds to it, we could really begin. We're not waiting on any discoveries. We could actually engineer a reduction in CO2, which would be dramatic. What does it take? Public policy, of course, the will of the people, which determines public policy, and that's absent in many, many parts of the world. So we're watching this happen. And indeed, there's still a fringe set of people who really don't believe that, well, either that the problem's so big we shouldn't bother with it, or that humans really aren't adding at all to the changing climate. It's simply something which is autonomous and happening in the world itself. Coming back to oil and gas companies, there are plenty of people doing non-hydrocarbon energy. For oil and gas companies to do it, they have to diversify. They need permission of their stakeholders to do that, and they need to demonstrate that they can do that better than people who are experts at it. Some will, some won't. What they need to do is attend to their legacy before they attend to anything else.
I've been impressed by two people I've written about who self-sacrificingly have curtailed their own curiosity to tackle these kinds of problems. Elon Musk is one of them. If he were left to his own devices, in a sense, he would want to be building double-decker highways. He would want to be building supersonic airplanes. He would want to be doing the Hyperloop. He would want to be fully pursuing the Boring Company to build tunnels under the earth for cars and trains. Instead, when he's not, getting in trouble with the SEC, he's basically focusing on getting us to Mars, and doing that in two ways. One is through SpaceX, and the other is through Tesla. And the idea is, like, if we can wean ourselves off of carbon-based energy systems, we buy more time so we can live here longer, so we can use SpaceX to eventually get us to Mars. The other guy is Pat Brown, who created Impossible Burger. And he was a biochemist happily running a lab at Stanford, doing lots of different things. but really annoyed by the fact that no one was noticing how animal agriculture was contributing so heavily to greenhouse gases and destroying the planet in a variety of other ways. And he felt like no one was tackling this problem, and that no matter how much talk there was about it and how much, well, we should really address this, no one was doing anything. So he's like, I'm going to build a better burger, one that tastes like a meat burger, so we can get all the people who eat meat to stop eating that and start eating this plant-based burger. And he's given the last 10 years of his life to doing it, and he said to me, it's like, hamburgers are stupid. Like if you told me 10 years ago I would be making hamburgers, I would have said, well, that's not a life I want to lead. But I think he was, in a way saying, I'm doing this for everyone so that we can all be here. And I think that is an inspiring idea that there is, in this particular way of engineering us out of the problem, people are doing things that you think, well, that actually, you're doing this for the rest of us, and that's encouraging.
To me, and I think they really are important, because they show something can be done, rather than let's just talk about it. I think what we're still missing is things that really begin to move the needle in a very big way. And for that, we absolutely need public policy to move. Now, I think in Europe that's going to happen. It may not be the most elegant things they're going to do, but I do think that they'll move reasonably quickly for some form of carbon tax and a border tax on carbon. So if you don't tax your carbon when it comes into Europe, you'll get taxed. They'll probably do it at the expense of economic growth, which is fine. They will do it as an investment for the future. So I think that there is going to be movement here, there's no doubt. Some of the states of the United States are clearly moving in the right direction, in spite of federal government not liking it. But we still don't have enough things moving in the right direction. Point about beef is I think it's known by everybody. The problem with beef is not only the animals, but it's what's fed to them, which is soy, and soy is replacing forests. So the whole thing compounds again and again. So if you could really do it in a very widespread way, would make a very big difference.
Yeah, and there are different levels of conversation, right? You can go to the government to say you have to impose certain laws. You can go, which are not being imposed, to control
and incentives.
Incentives. You can go to the corporations and you can tell them, come on, you want to be with the world? The consumers have more power than they think they do, because if you change the mindset and you say, I'm not going to buy products from a company that I don't believe in because they are doing this or that to the environment, and if more and more people do that, the company will be forced to change because that's all they care about. So, but people don't feel as empowered as they could to make change themselves one by one. It is clear and has been demonstrated quantitatively that the single most effective thing a person can do to help with this thing is to not necessarily stop eating meat, but definitely decreasing meat consumption. You do not need to eat meat or something related to meat every day. You can do it twice a week. And you can, and that will make a gigantic change. But that is a question of mindset. And lots of questions here. And I wish I could spend 3 hours here with all of them. Some of them are awesome, and some of them are angry because there seems to be a limit on how many words you can put in here. I have nothing to do with these guys. They just gave me this stuff. I'm just the reader. Don't shoot me. But essentially, they say things like, how can we change the mindset if at the school level there are disputes between teaching sciences and the humanities, and sciences have more value than the humanities. And this is a primary, secondary, and definitely at the university level as well. The humanities, they feel like they're being sort of pushed to the corner, that everybody wants to know about the science, and you really need a more cross-disciplinary engagement to deal with these issues. So changing completely this conversation to the level of education. So is there something that we can do so that people are educated in a more globally mindful way, so that they can understand that they, one by one, can make a change, and is that something which is utopic, or is that something that we should all be doing in our homes, when we're sitting together with our kids and grandkids, etc.?
It's been a topic and a problem since I think humans really began to gather together. How do you more appropriately deal with resources generally? And we've never really cracked it, except when there are no resources, when times are shrink, when times are tough. So I think, there is, so that I think is a tough one. I do think one thing that is important is, I think when you look at the world, at least in my opinion, there are only two deeply existential threats today that we need to worry about. One is climate change, and the other one is antimicrobial resistance. They're very different in substance, and why they are existential, that's another discussion. But they are things that we should really be gripped by. I think climate change is gripping us in that we see local weather phenomena that are very unusual, that have changed the way we understand our local environment is meant to be. Whether that is, I was in LA during the wildfires coming right into town. Look at what's happened to Australia. I have a second home in Venice, and I don't mean Florida. It's Venice, Italy. And you can see there the meaning of a fragile city. And remember, we all live, many, many great cities are on the coast and exposed to changes in sea level and changes in currents. So a lot of things that are beginning to make people focus on something's changing, and we need to, and we think it's to do with climate change. And that, I think, is important. It focuses people's minds. The correlations may not be exact, but it certainly does promote and provoke people into saying something has to happen, and that's good.
To add one dystopic footnote, since this is my role, apparently, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists last week set the doomsday clock, which they've been keeping since 1945, since we had an atomic bomb, forward or closer to midnight. It's only 100 seconds from midnight now. And the reason for that, for advancing it from 2 minutes to a minute and 40 seconds, they said was many of the factors you just mentioned, but also nuclear proliferation, which we kind of forget about as a possible way of wiping ourselves out, and also cyber threats to governments and to regimes, and also disinformation that technology is helping to, unfortunately, perpetrate and propagate.
Yeah, there's a question here. I'll read it to you, Ted. It's, isn't dystopia a matter of perspective? In the Middle Ages, humanism was the rising new evil against Christianity. Look at us now. Why be afraid of change?
Yeah, I think that's probably right up to a point. I also sort of think the bit of advice that it's better to panic too early than panic too late is not terrible either.
It is an attitude of mind. I just hope that it is fact-based. And I think we run a big danger of non-fact-based creation of dystopias. I think fact-based analysis needs to be reinvented. You can only go so far on assertions, but I think there are things to worry about, and there are things which are not to worry about. It's a statement of the obvious, really, but I think facts keep you honest here and reduce the number of things you need to worry about. There are always things to worry about, but general dystopias I don't buy.
Right. Okay, there's one person that, or maybe more than one, that said that the problem related to climate change is also overpopulation, that just too many of us, and is there something that should be done about that?
Well, in the development world, that's often called the 2050 problem. Most people think we'll have 10 billion people on the Earth by 2050, and the question is, how do we basically use the resources we have and increase them in a way that we can feed everyone, and also not destroy the planet in the process? So, I don't think there is no answer that I've seen published anywhere to that problem.
No, I mean, there are plenty of ideas and schemes to feed 10 billion. I think can be done, probably.
If you're
The second part of the problem is
Probably.
harder, perhaps.
If you
Second
become
part of the problem
vegetarians,
is tough.
maybe. That's the...
But I think population control is not some. I mean, it is what it is. We are going to have 9 to 10 billion people on the planet. So we now need to look to see how we can live with 9 to 10 billion people and what we do, whether it is how we deal with cities, which is a very big issue. Can cities actually work the way they work today forever? I think is unlikely. When I went to speak to all these architects about build, I thought, they'd talk to me about engineering buildings and, why cement and why elevators and steel were the most important things in their lives because it allowed them to build higher. Actually, all of them to a person, and all the most distinguished people wanted to talk about urban planning and integration of cities into the general environment, including the agricultural environment, because that is the pressing problem for more population.
Mm-hmm.
Although cities are actually much more environmentally responsible than any other, forms of human habitation in terms of energy use. They're much more efficient and use fewer resources generally, and so, they may not be able to continue as they are.
I think the problem is getting the people in and out of the cities.
Yeah, another question then. There are some protests by physicians in the audience saying that, hey, we have a lot of empathy too. What are you talking about? And I vouch for that. I totally agree. But it is a concern, right, that the automation and the more use of database is going to certainly change expertise in different ways. So just one closing thought / provocation, which I think reflects some of the questions that we couldn't address here, apart from ones that were a little more pointed and personal and somewhat mean, which I won't read. The idea that clearly we humans are a remarkable species. If you think that we are like these self-aware molecular machines made of stardust that are capable of doing what we do in terms of inventiveness, it's truly remarkable what has happened in the last 10,000 years, right? No question about it. We have completely changed the world to the point of calling it now that we're living in the Anthropocene for bad reasons, unfortunately, but we clearly have had an impact on this planet which is irreversible at this point. So from a point of technicality, like we as technical problem solvers, we're amazing. But from a moral perspective, from distinguishing what is good and what is bad, for moving away from tribalism, divisions that are sort of ingrained and that polarize us, I would claim that we are still in the caves, that we have evolved morally very little. And yes, we have more of us, maybe less people die in wars, but there are still a lot of people under tremendous suffering in the world. So perhaps the root of the problem is not so much how we can invent our salvation and rescue, but how we can reinvent ourselves as a species with a higher moral ground to deal with ourselves and the planet. So that to me is really the fundamental question that brings together the sciences and the humanities. And I wanted to leave you guys with this thought. How can we do that, right? Because clearly we're still as polarized in many ways as we have always been. And I wanted to invite you both to have some closing remarks as well before we go out to have drinks and be merry and pretend we didn't talk about anything difficult.
Well, I came up with a little plan to reinvent the species backstage, actually, so I'm glad you asked about that. I do not have one.
Next year, folks, come
Yeah,
back.
come back. I guess there's a fact I was reading recently that, speaking of caves, there's a cave in Spain that's 430,000 years old, and they found 30 hominids at the bottom of the cave, and their skulls have been broken open with hand axes, probably. So that's, you could argue the first mass murder that we are aware of. And you can look at that negatively, obviously, and say that we are a species that kills each other. Or you could say, you know what, we're still here. Despite this impulse, these homicidal rages, despite the fact that we are tribal and divisive and prone to doing incredibly self-destructive things, we've somehow managed to keep going this far.
Yeah, I don't have a solution either. What I have is maybe just an observation, which I think is something that keeps humanity going. It's that sense of wonder and exploration and imagination. We do things that can only be explained by our quest for different things and knowledge and just different places. I went to see, as I was writing this book, at NASA Goddard, the James Webb Space Telescope. You could argue it's a folly, or you could argue it's a wonderful thing. I think it's a wonderful thing. It's going to be launched, I think, to the second Lagrangian point. It's a very long way away from Earth. It's going to unfold. It's like origami. It's going to reverse itself out. It's going to unfold into a great big umbrella, and it's going to point itself to the edge of the universe. So it'll kind of look at the beginning. It's getting closer to the beginning of time, far away objects, and we're going to understand a bit more about where we live. And I think that's what allows us constantly to renew and to think of ourselves as really very unimportant pieces of a much bigger puzzle. And I think from time to time that's good, and it keeps us honest and reminds us how actually quite unimportant we are, which is probably a good thing.
Can I close with one comment about that? Because that's what I work on. So it's too passionate for me. I would say that precisely because we are able to, this Greek philosopher Protagoras, he used to say that man is the measure of all things, right? And I think it's the other way around. We are the things that can measure. And that makes all the difference. And because we can measure and we have looked out into the universe and into ourselves and into the origin of matter and the most elementary particles that exist, we have learned so much about who we are and what we are capable of, that instead of being insignificant, we actually should be thinking ourselves as being very significant, because we are, in a sense, how the universe thinks about itself. And we need that self-esteem in order to protect our species. Because if we think we are nothing, then we lose nothing by destroying ourselves.
I think we have to think of ourselves in perspective.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean to say we're nothing.
Good.
But we're not the giants of the universe.
Well, until further notice, we are pretty awesome. Thank you, guys. Bye.